Hey everybody, as we announced last week, we ended up hooking up with the Foundation showrunner, David S. Goyer, to talk about the show's first season, and I thought the interview went really well. Well, we had so many questions, I was actually blown away. We had, I don't know, 10, 15 times more questions than we did usually get feedback. It was crazy. More than we could give, like if we were able to cycle through a question and answer every minute, like it's a lightning mode. Especially since David gave us, I thought, really well thought out, thoughtful answers, and that always limits the amount of questions you get. But I don't know, I actually prefer the in-depth stuff rather than kind of a breadth of just commonly asked questions and stuff.
Quality over quantity. Yes.
Yeah, that's our motto here at Bald Move.
On our 2-hour podcast. Yeah,
exactly. Not a second could be trimmed or otherwise restated for brevity or wit. No. Yeah, we like to thank David for being very generous with his time. Special thanks also to his assistant Tyler, who helped set all this stuff up and made sure everything went great. Thanks to all of you who sent questions. We did get to use quite a few of them. And it also seems likely that we'll be able to get Mr. Goyer back. Seemed like he had a good time and thought we did a decent job asking him questions. So he seemed kind of excited to wrap up the season with us too. So already looking forward to that. Without further ado, please respect and enjoy this interview. So David, we talked about this a little bit in the pre-interview, but this is kind of like one of the last unfilmable science fiction book concepts. Like they've kind of fallen one by one. Lord of the Rings, like Denis Villeneuve is taking on Dune right now.
Villeneuve, I think it's Villeneuve.
I'm a famous mush mouth and I struggle with pronunciation. So I've had a couple of French and French Canadian people connect me, and I just kind of it's like my cursive signature. It's just a gesture towards it.
Right.
I was wondering, so you're tackling this unfilmable project. Was there like a single moment or idea that you had that made you think this is the thing that's going to crack this thing open? And then conversely, was there ever like in the production a moment doubt, like, oh crap, we bit off more than we can chew?
Yes. I mean, it's interesting because I started this project 4 years ago. And because COVID obviously added a year to it. And so in some cases, doing these podcasts or interviews after the fact, thinking about going back to when we were writing, I'm literally having to think back 3 years ago or whatnot to, but I think that there were, I think in terms of initially cracking it, there were two big ideas. One I can talk about, one I can't because it hasn't been revealed yet. But the genetic dynasty was the first big one, and that was the first big aha experience that Josh Friedman, who wrote the first 2 episodes with me, that we had fairly early in and maybe a week or so into it, because we were just trying to figure out, I think the 2 biggest issues with Asimov's first book are obvious, the fact that it's very anthological and that so much happens off stage or off screen. And I talked about this in the AMA that I did, but there was no version of any of the buyers doing an anthological version of the show. That just was never going. In fact, they said outright, we won't. So don't even bother pitching a version of that. Because in the wake of Black Mirror, which I love, there were just all of these anthological shows that sprung up, some of which have come out, some of which haven't. But almost all of which have completely crashed and burned, at least economically. So they were just like, there's no way. So we knew we could never do an anthological show. And so we knew we had to have some version of a continuation of characters. But then I just thought you can't. Two big things that happen, at least in the original trilogy that Asimov has, is the Empire falls off screen, which just as a streaming show or television show isn't dramatic. And the other thing that happens is that the second foundation in the original trilogy just is formed completely off screen and is literally sort of like a Deus Ex Machina that shows up late in the game. And for obvious reasons, neither of those were going to work in an adaptation. So and then the other thing, which is just practical, is you're doing these big giant shows and you're hiring cast and you want to ensure that they stick around from season to season. So there needs to be some continuity. And so that's how we that necessity led us to the idea of the genetic dynasty. And so that even though the three emperors were, ostensibly different characters from season to season or from episode to episode, the audience would relate to them emotionally in some ways as the same face. And and so that allowed us, at least for, what will be the first few seasons, to put a face to the Empire and to invest in it emotionally. But then it also led to so many of the things that you guys were talking about on the show, all these incredible nature versus nurture stories, that is just this beautiful and strange and messed up dynamic that I've just never seen before really on a show. And then I think an extension of that was pulling Demerzel in from the prequels, who then is their eternal minder,
mommy,
governess, what have you. And, Asimov has always in his works, a lot of his robots are very soulful. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting as well, because at least in terms of the Empire and Demerzel, that has allowed us in a way to have these effectively immortal characters that we could be telling these stories with. And so that was just a major aha experience. And then, like I said, there's another one that I can't reveal yet. And maybe maybe this goes okay, maybe we can do an after season one and we can talk about it. We'll see.
That'd be fascinating. That'd be great.
So do you think of these things more from a storytelling standpoint when you're developing concepts like the clone dynasty? Or are there some things that you think of from just, hey, this would be cool technology sort of perspective?
For me, I started out as a writer. It's always story first. And then as a filmmaker, there's sort of practical considerations. But it's always story. It's always what makes sense. It has to be story driven. They are, I think you guys invoked the rule of cool at some point, which I occasionally do, but I never come from a place of, hey, wouldn't it be cool to do this? And then let's figure out a way to back into it. I really come from, what are the themes that we're exploring? What's fundamental to this character? It's always story first.
How did you? So one of the things I'm fascinated with in movie making and filmmaking and TV making is the breaking the act of like breaking a story. You've got it. Like, how do I chunk this out into 10 episode chunks to most effectively tell it? I was wondering, like, how do you make decisions? Like, there had to be some version of the story where you just told kind of Gail's story. You began at the beginning with the, stuff on Synax kind of going sideways and her disillusion of the faith, and then how that kind of propelled her into Harry's orbit. But instead you told a very truncated version of that in episode 1, and then came back in episode 5. How do you kind of like make the decisions about which of those would be more effective or interesting?
Yeah. I know I'm going to try not to make all of my answers be really long-winded. So
that's what the people are here for.
Yeah. So there's a couple of considerations, and one of them is storytelling. One of them is practical. There's 3 answers. So one is, I like to work on the kind of show that I want to watch. And so I like sometimes playing around with unreliable narratives or narrators. And sometimes I like presenting something in one way and letting the audience sit with that for a while, and then turning it on its head or revealing that there's more to the story than we realize. That's just my personal preference for storytelling. I also sometimes, not that every episode has to have a cliffhanger, and believe it or not every episode of this season has a cliffhanger, although most of them have so far. And sometimes I just like a cliffhanger, and Game of Thrones started this, but sometimes I like going dark on a character for an episode or a storyline. Some of the audience may not like that. I like that. I think that's interesting sometimes to leave a character at a certain place, especially when you're telling a story that's so sprawling where you've got 3 or 4 different storylines. I think it's valid to leave a character here and then come back to them an episode or 2 later. I understand that some of the audience has been frustrated with us doing that in this show. I would also say that there are 2 practical considerations that have nothing to do with storytelling. The first is some of our actors, we only have them for 6 out of 10 episodes. Like literally, that's how many episodes we can do with them for a variety of reasons. We didn't have enough money, or they're not available. And so some of them, we literally can't put them in every episode, no matter how much we might want to. And there are some storylines or characters where I would have put them in more, but we can't. So then we have to figure out, okay, we got this actor for X amount. Okay, I guess we're going to go dark on them. Sometimes literally it comes down to that and has nothing to do with my preference. Even though we have a lot of money on the show, there are some things that are out of our hand that have just nothing to do with storytelling considerations. Another one that's odd, that's just interesting is I'm really curious, I don't know, a few months from now, after the new year, what the experience of people that watch the show, that binge the show is like versus watching it from week to week. And I'm just curious, and we'll have to talk to people that we know that don't know the show, what that experience is like. So a person's tolerance for us going dark on a character for an episode may be very different if they know that they can watch 3 in a row, or they know that they can watch, another episode the next day versus something coming out week to week. And then some people have complained, well, why isn't this show just dropping all at once? That's way above my pay grade, right? Because that's all about like Netflix is deciding to do this, or they're deciding to do that, that I have no control over that. But I will say from Apple, their personal experience was that, because they've been experimenting with how they release stuff, is that their most successful shows so far have dropped weekly, and slowly the audience is built. And that's been their success, because we debated how many of Foundation to drop, and they said, we can show you the numbers on how our stuff is built, where we tried it with, we're dropping 3 and doing this and doing that. And we're like, the most successful has been this. And so, and again, it wasn't my call. And it may frustrate people that they have to wait, but then you could also argue that that means they're into it. So super long-winded answer. Sorry, but those are all the things.
Well, that's the same thing that we've seen with our podcast, is when we have a show that we're covering that's a binge show, like a Stranger Things or something, not all of the episodes get the same traffic as the first and the last episode.
Right.
And that just makes sense, because especially with television shows, if you drop everything, it's going to be around for a week or 2, maybe 3 if you're lucky. And then
it's over.
Talking about it, right? Because the next show has dropped. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
It's harder to build the audience.
And there's another tack on consideration, which is this show takes a really long time to make, right? Mm-hmm. Or like a really long time. It actually takes close to 2 years to make a season. Now, we're not going to, in success, release a season every 2 years, which is why we had to write the scripts at least. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that season 2 was going to happen, but the scripts were written a while ago, right? Oh, and okay. If it takes a long time to make a season, you don't want to just go, blah, here it is. You want to at least get 2 months out of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's kind of like how the sausage is made, but
yeah, no, that's something that's where we debate all the time, which is better, binge or weekly. And it seems like more and more the answer, if you're a fan that likes to have water cooler conversations about something or want to see your favorite show grow an audience, it's weekly. You might want to binge it, but it's better for the show. I also,
as a fan, I think if a show drops all at once and you're someone that's coming to it a week or a month later, I find it annoying because there's more opportunity for it to be spoiled.
100%. 100%. Yeah. I was curious because, some things when you're talking about sci-fi, the scale just beggars the human imagination. Anytime you're talking about galactic empire, I remember when I was a boy, like they're talking about the Imperial Starfleet has 1,000 Star Destroyers. That sounds like a lot. Like, my God, how many Star Destroyers you need? But then the Empire is supposed to have 1 million worlds. So it's like, that seems a small number. I was wondering how you guys settled on the number 8 trillion for all souls in the Milky Way galaxy. Was that like any back and forth, or did you just like pick a big number, or was there any like back of the envelope calculations, or did that just seem big? Because it kind of works as a loose model for Earth. I noticed that too. Like we have roughly 8 billion. Yeah.
It does, but then you think, but in terms of the galaxy, that seems like a small number. Right. And then I also think, so I'll tell you, we arrived at it in a couple of ways. We do have science advisors. The bummer with COVID of it all was they were on in the beginning, and then the show was getting made, shot out of order over the course of 2.5 years, and the science advisors weren't around. It was very hard to always keep track. And spoiler, there may be some screw ups here or there. You know what I mean? That we've tried our best, but there probably are some. But I think in Asimov's original book, he mentioned quadrillion or quintillion. And it's funny because we were bandying that around, knowing that if the show was going to work, it would have to work for non-geek audience,
Right.
Not the tiny sliver. And I'm not dissing the books at all. I adore the books, but the amount of our audience that have read the books is such a tiny fraction as to be completely negligible for the success of the show.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking to people that hadn't read the books, that weren't science fiction fans, and they were like, I can understand 1 trillion because people talk about like Biden's package is 1 trillion, right?
Sure.
But a quintillion, that just seems like so whatever that I can't even relate.
I couldn't tell you how much bigger than 1 trillion that is.
So
like, I have to look it up.
Some of it was just practical. But the other thing that I wanted to point out, which maybe will become more apparent, hopefully, in the success of the show, is there have been, since we went to the stars, there have been a variety of in mythology extinction events that have happened.
Sure.
That maybe 90% of humanity this isn't the first disaster that's happened.
Right.
And some of that we'll get into later.
Okay.
The other thing I wanted to point out is that there are more habitable planets and more people out there than comprise the Empire. Even though the Empire is very big, there are a lot of planets that they're not on with people that they don't govern.
Gotcha.
Okay. I have questions always when I talk to people who are in writers' rooms, and I don't know how that looks right now with, COVID kind of spreading everybody out. I assume it's getting more back to normal.
No,
still
really
not?
It's over Zoom.
Wow, that seems really
like,
hard. That seems
like
10
this.
times harder.
It's like this, but with like Brady Bunch boxes, and yeah.
Sure. Okay. What's the
this is the story of a man named Goyer.
What's sort of the way that you approach that as far as breaking the story and then developing actual script? Does everybody pretty much touch every script, or is this something where you break stories and then you send sort of individual writers off to do script draft?
Well, I've never been in a room that I wasn't running, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I only know how I work on rooms. What I've been told by the writers that I work with is that my rooms for a drama show are very unusual, in that my drama room is more like a comedy room. And so generally what will happen is I'll write up a document, the sort of vomit document of like, it could be anywhere from 4 to 10 pages. Like, here's just some freewheeling thoughts I'm thinking about for this season, and I'll send it out, and None of this is set in stone. Some of this is mutually exclusive. You guys may have a million ideas that are better. It takes about 6 weeks to kind of break the season. We'll talk about it. I have there's a pecking order in writers' rooms, but mine is very egalitarian. So like the writer's assistant can pitch shit. The lowest rung is the staff writer and the highest rung is the executive producer, but I don't do any of that in my room. Anyone can talk, anyone can pitch on an idea. It's all good. And then we start breaking an episode. And in the old days, literally like there's a whiteboard, and it's like, okay, we decide where's the episode going to begin? Where's it going to end? What's the most dramatic way to get from A to B? Occasionally you get there and you're like, that doesn't totally fit. We'll push that thing into another episode. Then I'll assign the episode to a writer. And what I ended up doing with Foundation is everyone co-wrote episodes, because I sort of look at it like a baseball team, and different writers have different skill sets. Some are more plot driven, some are more, it just depends. So I'll think about who I think would be the most interesting combination for that episode. Then they write the script. They always get at least a rewrite. I'll give them notes. And then depending on what's happening, they might get another draft, or then it might kick to me and I'll do a polish on it, or it might kick to it like maybe one of the two senior writers. And then what we do, which is then what I'll do is, if we've gotten to the end of the season, then I break up storylines when we're revising, and I'll say, okay, you are doing a pass on all the scenes on Trantor. You're doing a pass on all the scenes on this. You're doing, and it depends. And I can sort of tell you who did what, but like I definitely touched all the scripts, but then other people did. And then sometimes I'll have people take a pass at my stuff too. Like I'm very egalitarian. I'm like, take a whack at it. I can always say no, like
sure.
Go for it. Or sometimes I'll be like, I didn't nail this, but you've got a better facility for this. You go for that. And then the final pass is, we've got a script that's been gone through like a couple of times, and we sit around, in the old days, around the table now, and we literally go through it page by page, and every writer line pitches on, you got to pitch for this. Can you beat that line? Can you beat that joke? Do you have a logic problem with this? The logic, and then and staff writers, anyone can pitch anything. That's the final pass. And then sometimes you get, I would say on the first season, the show reflects, well, visually, I would say it reflects 95% of my vision, story-wise, maybe 75%, and 25% were sort of concessions we had to make to the studio or Apple, or maybe 20%. Many well-meaning, but, there are definitely some things in first season that I'm like, if I had I wouldn't have done if I had complete, why did you do that? In some cases, I'm like, because I was told to and I had no choice, whatever. Mm-hmm. Again, I feel like these answers are very long-winded, but hopefully they're interesting.
No, I think they're exactly what people are looking for. So maybe a simpler one. I had some questions about the synax stones, the seer stones, in this planet that is like run by like a universal cult. Where does Gale go to get those removed? Is there like an apostates RS that you can, like just like where does she go?
I wanted to, and maybe this wasn't entirely clear, but like the model for synax was more like Afghanistan or Pakistan in that it wasn't always repressive and regressive. There were universities, they weren't always as technologically advanced as some of the other planets, but there were sort of seats of knowledge and inquiry and things like that. It wasn't always that way. And and yes, they were always spiritual, but the idea with the seers is that it's like when the Taliban came in, and then things got really messed up, and then there was a purge, then there was a cleanse. So maybe that wasn't entirely clear, but the idea is that really repressive era happened fairly recently.
And there's still pockets of intellectual resistance, like her old professor. And so that's where she's going.
Exactly. And there are places that are taking out the stones. And so the idea with it taking out the stones is that, look, some people gripe that we even went back to synax at all, but like, I wish I could have spent more time doing more world building, and
it's my favorite.
We will, and hopefully in success, continue to do more. But the idea is that there are certain acts of heresy for which you get drowned. But if you remove the stones, you're a non-person. So you're out in the cornfield, but you're a non-person. We won't help you, and you're literally not seen by God anymore, or us. We can't talk to you. We can't give you any food. We can't. So there are people on synax that have chosen to do that, and there may be these little pockets of people that have done that. And so by taking out the stones, what she's done, because they've said, you can't go to Trantor, you can't do is she's exiled herself.
Gotcha.
She still believes it's like the difference between, she's still culturally synaxian and culturally part of that. And she still believes in certain concepts of the sleeper. It's the seers that turned everything crappy.
Gotcha.
And so it was emotionally painful for her to take them out, but she also knew it was the only way she could escape, is if she exiled herself.
That makes a lot of sense. I was wondering, in this latest episode, just to hit last night, you reveal that Dawn is the new Dawn is colorblind.
Yeah.
In the previous scene where he had the elder brother Darkness on his last day, when he painted that mural as kind of like a hopeful thing of like, building again and coming together. And it was kind of like a scene as like an act of petulance or like immaturity to paint that over.
Right.
But now that we know that he's colorblind, are you implying that maybe he never even knew like what the meaning of that was at all? Like it wasn't like a conscious rejection of this message. It's just that it was like a colorblind test that he failed.
You're probably going to hate this answer, but it's both. Meaning he was impetuous, and I can't. You're going to learn a little bit more about where his head is at next episode, in episode 7. But he also can't. So if Dusk's job, among other things, is to work on the mural and instruct Dawn, there's just all this shit and nuance that Dawn can't pick up because he's colorblind. And so it's frustrating, and he's worried about revealing it we'll get into that in future episodes.
So he's literally a step behind in the development, not just because lack of interest or because the day and the dusk are sleeping on the job, but he actually has an impairment, like a learning disability. In his culture.
Okay, so one of my kids had some dyslexia, right?
Sure. So I can relate.
It's frustrating, and then they like, I don't want to do that, and then some of it's covering, and so it's kind of all of the above.
I noticed that in the AMA, you said that you famously got this 8-season, 10 episode per plan. But you also hinted that you are thinking of going beyond not just the stuff written in the novels, because you've obviously played a little bit of jazz with that already, but you're going to go beyond even the timeline, like take the story further. I was wondering, does that mean you're actually going to expand the setting itself, not just like expand the characters and the world building, but you're actually going to tell a story that goes beyond what Asimov written?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like on one hand, when that came out that I had this 8-season plan, people were excited. They were like, "Oh, cool!" And on the other, people were like, "How dare he be that ambitious?" I don't know, but it was also, Apple demanded it. They just said, this is a big investment. Can you prove to us that? I had to talk for 2 hours about where I thought the story was going. It wasn't just, they were like, okay, here's a blank check. I really had to like sing for my supper. So, when we were talking to the Robin Asimov and the Asimov estate, the idea from the beginning was that Asimov never finished the story. He talked about never finishing the story. He didn't. He got one of the reasons why he wrote the prequels is because he couldn't figure out, or he hadn't arrived at the right idea. He never finished the 1,000 years. He never got to the end. And that's why he went backwards first. And he had regrets. And I had lots of conversations with his daughter about this. And I have some vague ideas of where he was thinking of going. But yes, the intention is, if we're fortunate enough to ever get there, that we will go beyond what he got and get to the end of it. Because I think he only got to about, please don't, well, you will quote me on this, but like people harp on like, oh my God, he got it wrong. Like 578 years or 586 years into the story, he never got to the end of the 1,000 years. So I'm not going to tell you in what season that will happen, but the intention is, yes, we are going to go beyond where he got. Which is why I think on one podcast you guys were surmising how future seasons were going to break down, which is why it's not really fair, because you don't know how far beyond how many episodes or seasons that could take. So
we were looking at the books and like, how could you chop these and interleave them? But if there's new material on top of all that, it's pretty exciting, especially you hinted this inside information you got about the mind of Asimov and where he was leaning. That's fascinating. It is, yes.
There's definitely further material, but thank you so much. I'm not going to get into when we're going to get to that, but I will say that we do. Audience can decide whether or not we like it, but we do have sort of an outline of what those last 400 years are and where we're going to. And there are even some of the little tiny hints we've dropped now that are pointing to that.
Does the pedigree of Game of Thrones here make you nervous at all? We all kind of know how the audience received the end of that show, when they were just sort of operating with, a very slim net there. So
I think that Game of Thrones has cut both ways for us. So I think that Game of Thrones has made this show possible because streamers have said, oh my God, and not just because everyone wants their Game of Thrones, but because people are like, oh, wow, you really can do this epic with a lot of characters and have stories unravel over multiple seasons. I liked Game of Thrones. I have got my own theories about season 8 that I won't get into here. I do try to think about how an audience might perceive an ending, and which is why we put a lot of work into, at least we're writing towards something. And so we may never get there, but we have spent a lot of time figuring out the broad strokes of where we're going, so that hopefully it won't come as a surprise to people, or it won't feel like we took some crazy right turn. They may or may not like where we get to, but at least it won't have been set up.
Matt asked, this is either going to like be a fascinating discussion or it'll be 30 seconds. We'll cut it. Matt had a question for you. Have you heard of the mathematical historian Peter Turchin? He's been written in like the Atlantic and NY Magazine. Are you familiar with any of the stuff that he's come out with the last few years?
Is this the guy that was talking about these mathematical models for civilization and climate change and whatnot?
Yeah, he was an ecologist that studied pine beetles.
Yes.
And he got out of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I have, yes. And I didn't know him by name, and I believe I've read some of the articles that you're referencing, and we did talk about that in the writer's room.
Okay, because he even refers to himself as like the Harry Seldon of the 21st century. So.
Yes.
All right. Interesting stuff. David had a question. He says, I'm curious about the relationship between Foundation and Dune, especially how Dune, the book and the new film, might have influenced you and the Foundation team as you were in production.
Well,
yeah, I mean it's wild how this stuff comes in like bunches, but like Herbert and Asimov coming down the pike at the same time.
The film didn't influence us at all because
could have. Yeah,
it was written. The bulk of this show was written 4 years ago, and the bulk of it was designed 3 years ago, and we had no knowledge of what they were doing or who did. So there was zero influence in terms of filmically. I think that when did Dune first come out? Like 62 or 60 or something like that?
Yeah, in the mid 60s. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think the first Foundation book came out in 51 or 52. So, I mean, there are obviously Dune and Herbert were influenced by Foundation.
Sure.
So there are obviously some kind of antecedents or through line, or there is some shared DNA in it that just is what it is. Galactic Empire, whatnot. And I think we try to, in certain places, just say, well, Asimov got there first, so we're not going to change it. It's just, yes, there's a Galactic Empire. And I think in other places we thought, if there are ways we can stay true to Asimov, but maybe not go into Dune territory, maybe let's do that. And I'm sure if we had 4 hours, I could come up with some specific examples. Sure, but sure. I will say, I heard some people talking about in that great scene in 4 where Day shouts at the statistician and he dies, whether or not he was using some version of the voice. He wasn't. The guy just had a heart attack and killed. Well,
someone pointed that out to us, and I forgot this relationship exists. That guy he screamed to death was Baron Harkonnen from Sci-Fi.
No, that was intentional. Me as a geek. Because I looked at a list of who was available and I saw McNeese was available and I was like, oh, we're doing that, Nice. So that was, and we talked about Dune when we were filming that scene.
Sure.
But that was just me as a geek going, this is fun.
I got the lawnmower guy right outside my window. Aaron, you want to?
Do you want me to keep going? All right. I hate taking all the questions, but
I can't hear it for what it's worth.
No?
So
okay.
I can't. Okay, yeah. Go for it.
This one. Sean wants to know: can you describe the process of the art direction? I guess in as much as you interface with it, from like the costuming to the spaceship design to the buildings, things like that.
I mean, I interface with it completely. The art direction, the way that it works is, when the department heads have been hired, we sit down for a couple of days and I take them through literally a couple of days. We sit around either in a big conference table or a Zoom, whatever. And for about 3 days, I talk through the season and I talk through the big ideas or the art ideas or the costume ideas or character. It's always rooted in characters. So I say, this is the kind of character. So the costume should be this, or this is what this world feels like. So the sets and whatnot should feel claustrophobic, or they should feel expansive, or they should feel brutalistic, or they should, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I do this big 3-day download. And then I say to everyone, okay, go iterate, and then over the course of the next month or two, they have concept artists. They do mood boards where they're pulling stuff from, Pinterest and magazines and stuff like that. And then they come back and say, and then we do a process called this, not that. So like art department or wardrobe or whatever, we'll put up a bunch of stuff on a wall and I'll be like, that's our show. That's our show. That's not our show. That's not our show. That's not our show. And then organically stuff. Now I may not know, well, that's a more specific kind of architect or this or that, but organically it'll start to hone in and people will start with sketches and I'll say, what about this? What about that? And then it'll get really specific in terms of story. And then I'll say, that doesn't work for the story. So like there's not a single spaceship prop piece of wardrobe or color that I don't approve.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Tell you what, David,
down to
the jump
down to
ships.
the font, down to there's, I mean, even that Imperial symbol, we probably did, I don't know how many versions of look development. There might have been 40 different versions of that symbol that we honed in and we honed in and we honed in, and it was like, okay, that, you know.
I tell you, the jump ships, like, you, regardless of where else the series goes, like, you guys have gifted like an entirely new visualization of faster than light travel to the science fiction community. Like, I got out of my seat when I saw that thing fire up its singularity and fold space for the first time. It's just incredible.
Well, that was, but also it came from story. So we were talking about, obviously they need to travel faster than light, but I like the idea of folding space and inverting space. And I wanted to do something different than Star Wars or different than Star Trek. And I thought that, this kind of civilization was at least a type 2 civilization, the Galactic Empire.
Yeah, yep.
Maybe type 2.5. And so, and this particular representation of the Empire are kind of very, very masculine and very sort of, so I said, I want their ships to look like knife blades. And I drew on a napkin. I said, I want there to be a donut hole. And like, I want to see Trantor for the first time through the donut hole. And then I was like, and I think that's where they should generate the singularity. But the design of the ship also works for the knives of the Empire, and like they're, hanging over planets, like sort of Damocles. And so, but sure, it's all kind of story driven though, and then even down to when she first jumped into space, I said to Bear McCreary, our composer, I said, I know this is going to sound like a weird reference because I was remembering the crazy Disney film, The Black Hole, and John Barry's score for The Black Hole. And I said, it'd be great if you could evoke John Barry's score for The Black Hole when we're doing that, because we're sort of creating our own black hole. So yeah, we're all big nerds. We all talk about that stuff.
There's so much of it too. Like all of it. It's not just the jump ships. It's 10 different civilizations. And yeah.
Well, also, if you'll notice in the title sequence, it starts, there's all that pixelated stuff that obviously evokes the sandigrams and the sand on the mural and the sands of time and all that stuff was intentional, but it also starts with a black hole. I mean, there's literally a black hole as like the first image you see in the title sequence.
Yeah.
Very cool. Blair want to know if there's an actor in the Foundation that has surprised you with their interpretation of the character, and how was it different from your expectations when you casted them? Any surprises there?
Wow. I mean, Laura Byrne that plays Demerzel for sure. I mean, she was always they were always meant to be a soulful character, but when she came in and did her screen test, and it was a scene that's in episode 8 that I can't talk about yet, that is a mind-blowing scene. And I was at the screen test, and I was standing just beside the camera, and I cried in the screen test, and everyone there, just their jaws dropped, and we realized how incredible she was. And so Demerzel, it was always meant to be an important character of the show, and is a character that grows in their importance as the show continues. But when we saw these subtle little nuances that Laura could do, it kind of took it to a whole other level. And so now there are all sorts of things that we've written or are writing where we're like, oh my God, she can so pull that off without those 3 lines of dialogue. And yeah, I mean, she's amazing. They're all great, but that was a real revelation.
Yeah, she is great at like playing what's fundamentally and obviously an inhuman character, but has that, like you said, that soul stuff. It reminds you of kind of like what Brent Spiner was doing on Star Trek, like, someone who's not human but is a student of the condition.
She's Robin Asimov's favorite character.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Ari wants to talk a little bit more about the score and the process of coming up with the music for this show. What was that process like? How closely did you work with Bear McCreary? You talked a little bit, about this already, but did you just lock him in a room until he came out holding a Prime Radiant filled with music? What?
No. So Bear I've worked with before. He's a friend, and we talked a lot about what this kind of score would be for the show. And because the source material is so philosophical and intellectual and dry, amazing, but it is. I felt that we needed a score that would hold the audience's hand a little in terms of emotion, in terms of classicism, that would sometimes evoke John Williams a little bit, sometimes evoke some of the more classical scores. And so we talked about that from the beginning. And then he said, well, I'm going to work on the sort of theme first, which is in the title sequence. And he scored the title sequence, which doesn't always happen. And we adjusted some of the shots based on the score and vice versa. And he came up with the idea that tinkly thing that you hear at the beginning, that's actually a mathematical formula that creates that Prime Radiant theme.
Interesting.
And he worked with a computer programmer for that. And then I worked with him so very closely, and we identified like there's X amount of major themes for the show. And then he would write sort of suites for the not to any one particular thing. So there's Salvor's theme, there's Gale's theme, there's Harry's theme, there's the Prime Radiance theme, there's the Nacrian theme in season 1, and then I think then there's the Imperial theme. So I think there's 6 major themes. There's Demerzel's theme, maybe 7 in the first season. And so we would do different drafts of the themes. And I'm not musically oriented, but I talk about sort of feeling. And so fortunately, when I was back in post-production, I would go to his house, even in COVID, and we'd wear masks, and he would play stuff on the piano. And I would say, okay, we've locked in that theme now. And then what we do with each episode is once we picture lock the episodes, we sound spot, VFX spot, and music spot each episode. So we'll sit down for like 4 hours with Bear and his music editors, assistants, whatnot, and we'll turn the temp music off, and we'll watch the episode together, and we'll say, okay, so what's the feeling you want to evoke in this scene or this sequence? And we'll talk about that. And should there even be music in this sequence, or should it just be sound? So we spend about maybe 3 or 4 hours per episode on that. Then he writes a demo. I listen to it. I say, this works, this doesn't work. And then it goes to the orchestra. Then we do that with sound, where all the sound team, we watch it and we sound spot it, and we say, what kind of sounds are we looking for? What soundscape, or what do you have to ADR or dub? You're correct. Sometimes there is a fair amount of dubbing. Some of it was the wind in Fortaventura. Some of it was, certain people saying, because we shot in Europe, we don't want there to be an over preponderance of British accents. So in some case, we cast American actors. In other case, European actors were doing British accents, some well, some not so well. And so that's why some of that stuff was dubbed. And we do the same thing with visual effects. At one point I added up in post-production how many hours we spent on each episode between sound spotting and stuff like that. And it's like 200 hours per episode.
Jeez.
Just
wow.
Doing that kind of stuff.
That's incredible.
Crazy amount.
No wonder this took 2.5 years to make.
It's been over Zoom calls, no less.
Right?
A lot of it was visual effects. We were done in person because you have to look at it at 4K, and so everyone wore masks. By the way, I'll go. It's up to you. I can go a little longer if you want.
We actually are up again. We got a live show at 1, so we have to scoot. And we had tons of other questions. I'd love to talk for hours, but I thought maybe we close with one more.
Yeah.
What is your favorite episode of the season? Is it behind us or ahead of us?
It's ahead of us.
Really? Which one is it?
It's probably episode 8.
All right, I haven't seen that one. I haven't seen that one yet. I'm excited. So that's the one you're really waiting for people. You're kind of cackling in your hole, waiting for reactions from.
I really like episode. I like them all, but I like episode 3 a lot. I know some people, for some people it's challenging, some people it's not. I like episode 8 a lot. I really like episode 10, and 10 some crazy shit happens.
Awesome.
Love it. I love it. I love it in with the bang. And like I said, hopefully we get you back on for a season wrap up, because I know we're planning on doing a final like after the last season wrap up. And if we get you back on to do some more Q&A, that'd be great.
I think that would be I think that would be fun. And it was fun hearing you guys riff on the library of, I'm not sure if it's pronounced Babel or Babel, but I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I've heard it. Really... See, I always heard it Babel, but I guess it is actually Babel, which makes sense because, like, babbling, Well,
that might be a bastardization of Babel.
Sure,
Babel.
Sure.
No, I heard you say that on the official podcast. I was like, oh boy, you really blew our minds with that one.
There might be something there.
Okay.
I'm excited because that's a hell of a. I was not aware of that concept, and I was reading the wiki. I'm probably gonna have to read the book just to kind of get a little bit more background on it. But man, what a fascinating concept to weave into this.
And yes, there might be something to. I think one of your listeners was talking about the great man theory. So there's certainly something we talked about in the show. Yeah.
Sure. It does seem like Foundation and Dune kind of have a call and response. Like Foundation is about the masses, doing things and kind of being uncontrollable, where Dune is about a singular will exerting their force in the galaxy.
I know you got to go, but our show is going to play a lot of this sort of theme of variation, like, law of mass action, individuals don't matter. Do individuals matter? Can the future be changed? Are we living in a deterministic future? I mean, that's the sort of jazz themes we're working with.
Awesome. It's such a great time to be a science fiction fan right now. And,
I think so.
Thank you for contributing to the overall lore and the smorgasbord that we have today. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
David S. Goyer, everybody. Thanks for coming on the show.